Hey everyone! Tonight we embark on a journey that smells faintly of humid jungle, sweat, and the acrid smoke of internal combustion engines that absolutely refuse to work. We're heading deep into the History's Hidden Stories archive to pull out a tale of overwhelming technological disparity, met not by bigger guns, but by sharp sticks. Specifically, we're refocusing on the Filipino resistance fighter who managed the impossible, stopping columns of Japanese Imperial Army tanks using nothing more than strategically placed bamboo spikes. It sounds like something from a slapstick comedy or maybe a low-budget action movie, but the reality was intensely brutal and deeply strategic. Imagine yourself standing on a muddy, tree-lined road in the Philippines in late 1941. The air is thick, not just with moisture, but with a palpable sense of dread. You can hear it coming before you see it, a deep, churning metallic rumble that vibrates the very ground beneath your feet. This isn't a tractor or a truck. This is the sound of conquest, of superior engineering, and of a force determined to simply roll over anything in its path. You see the first vehicle crest, the Ryza Squat, formidable Type 97 Chiha medium tank, followed by armored personnel carriers, their treads tearing up the soft earth. They are the apex predator of the battlefield, protected by steel, armed with cannon, and moving with an efficiency that screams, resistance is futile. If you were standing there, armed only with a vintage bolt-action rifle, maybe a machete, and definitely a very short lifespan, you would feel utterly helpless. The Japanese military machine was a crushing, overwhelming fact. Their armor had proved devastating across Southeast Asia, and here, on the beautiful, broken islands of the Philippines, they were achieving rapid, terrifying success. They had planes, tanks, and ships. You had jungle, courage, and a growing sense of desperation. It's a reality check that quickly sinks in. If you had to face that column with those tools, you probably wouldn't survive this. Their heavy armor meant your standard rifle fire was little more than an annoying ping. Their speed meant you couldn't outflank them, and their doctrine was unforgiving. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening live, drop a comment below and let me know where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. The community we've built here, exploring these forgotten corners of history, is genuinely the best part of this gig. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The context of this fight is critical. By the time we enter the scene, the Philippines, a territory of the United States, was reeling from the initial catastrophic Japanese offensive. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was immediately followed by a coordinated assault across the Pacific, and the Philippines was a primary target. A crucial mainstream historical fact is that within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese planes decimated American air bases in the Philippines, neutralizing the primary defense force, which was a massive tactical blunder by the U.S. command that left planes vulnerable on the ground. This swift aerial knockout paved the way for the invasion forces to land virtually unopposed. The speed with which the Japanese advanced was shocking, not just to the Americans and Filipinos, but to the world. Their initial landings in Luzon, the main island, were highly effective. Leveraging superior doctrine and equipment against forces still using World War era tactics and gear, you can just imagine the scene: confusion, delayed orders, and the terrifying sight of well-drilled enemy troops pouring ashore. But here is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes into play. Many of the Filipino troops fighting alongside the Americans were drawn from the Philippine Commonwealth Army, an entity established just a few years prior. Their uniforms were often locally made, their training uneven, and many were not career soldiers but newly mobilized young men. One widely reported anecdote is that some units lacked proper boots and actually marched into battle wearing chinelas, flip-flops, or simple sandals, trying to keep up with the withdrawing U.S. forces. It paints a picture of a defense force cobbled together, dedicated, but tragically under-equipped for the mechanized warfare barreling toward them. You're fighting tanks, but your footwear's optimized for a trip to the market. That's the definition of a losing battle, right? The rapid initial Japanese success, however, wasn't a sign of universal surrender. Even as major commands faltered and fell back, small pockets of resistance solidified, hardening into the nucleus of what would become a vast and surprisingly coordinated guerrilla movement. The concept of resistance was culturally inherent. For centuries, Filipinos had resisted various foreign occupations, and this was just the latest, and perhaps most brutal, iteration. Historians still argue whether the U.S. decision to withdraw its forces into the defensive enclave of Bataan, effectively abandoning Manila as an open city, saved more lives than it cost in terms of initial morale. Was it a strategic necessity to preserve the fighting core, or did it send a signal of abandonment that fueled the cynicism of those left behind to fend for themselves? Either way, the vacuum left by the formal army's retreat provided the fertile ground for true, decentralized local heroism to bloom. As we continue, we'll see how this vacuum wasn't filled by surrender, but by a determination so fierce it could turn a simple stalk of bamboo into a weapon of strategic importance. The stage is set for an epic, asymmetrical confrontation, one where the biggest tool in the arsenal is simply knowing your enemy's weak points and your environment's strengths. The initial shock of the invasion quickly transitioned into the desperate, brutal reality known as the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. You watch as the organized American and Filipino forces, the USAFFE, United States Army Forces in the Far East, were driven inexorably back. The strategy was sound on paper. Hold the line, force the Japanese to commit resources, and wait for reinforcements. But the reinforcements never came. You witnessed the grinding attrition of the battle for Bataan Peninsula, where jungle warfare, disease, and starvation became as deadly as enemy bullets. For 4 agonizing months, from January to April 1942, these forces held out. Imagine the daily existence, the constant shelling, the relentless patrols, and the creeping realization that the food rations were dwindling to nothing. You're subsisting on half a scoop of rice a day, fighting against a fully supplied enemy, all while the malaria mosquitoes turn your nights into fever dreams. This prolonged resistance is a mainstream historical fact that shocked the Japanese high command, who had expected a quick, clean conquest. The dogged defense of Bataan became a symbol of Allied resistance in the Pacific, a testament to the sheer physical and mental endurance of the soldiers involved. However, on April 9, 1942, the inevitable arrived. The main force, exhausted and out of ammunition, was forced to surrender. You see the columns of defeated soldiers begin the harrowing march that would become known as the Bataan Death March, a tragedy of wartime brutality that forever scarred the islands. But even as Bataan fell, a stubborn, final redoubt remained. The fortified island of Corregidor, nicknamed the Rock, sitting squarely at the mouth of Manila Bay. Corregidor was a fortress built into the rock itself, bristling with coastal artillery and designed to withstand a siege. You can almost feel the concussive shockwaves of the Japanese bombardment as they hammered the island relentlessly for weeks. The commander, Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, held on until May 6, 1942. His surrender was not just a military defeat, it represented the total collapse of formal organized resistance under the American flag in the Philippines. The Japanese now officially controlled the islands. Here is where a quirky or fringe tidbit reveals a moment of calculated defiance. Prior to the surrender, the remaining U.S. commanders and high-ranking Filipino officers destroyed almost all of their remaining assets' codebooks, maps, and even their flag to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. But they also took the time to meticulously arrange for certain key personnel, particularly younger, highly motivated officers, to slip away before the formal surrender. These officers were given vague, unofficial orders. Don't surrender, go inland, continue the fight. It was a quiet acknowledgement that while the army was broken, the war was not over. It was a secret, unofficial contingency plan hatched in the final desperate hours. The collapse of the command structure left a massive void, but it also created an opportunity for true independence of action. The officers who melted into the jungle did so without uniforms, without pay, and without a reliable chain of command. They became, almost instantly, outlaws and rebels, yet they carried the moral authority of the fallen government. Historians still argue whether General Wainwright's decision to include all remaining U.S. and Filipino forces in his final surrender order, which was transmitted by radio to commanders across the archipelago, actually hindered or helped the subsequent guerrilla movement. Did it protect soldiers from being labeled mere brigands, or did it confuse the issue of legitimacy for those who chose to defy the order and keep fighting? The debate centers on the legality and practical impact of the surrender document on men operating hundreds of miles away, isolated and already fighting their own local battles. For those who chose to fight on, like the man whose story we are following, the surrender was simply a pivot point. The rules of engagement changed overnight. You no longer worry about military regulations or chain of command. Your sole focus is survival and making the enemy's occupation as expensive as possible. The concept shifts from large-scale maneuver warfare to small unit harassment, sabotage, and, crucially, learning how to be invisible. You realize that the jungle, which seemed like an oppressive, hostile environment to the large, mechanized army, is actually your greatest ally. It swallows sound, hides movement, and offers an infinite supply of raw materials, including that seemingly innocuous, yet incredibly versatile weapon we're working toward: bamboo. The Japanese may have won the conventional battle, but they had just walked into a years-long, total, unconventional war with an enemy they didn't know how to track, much less defeat. The time for large formations was over. The era of the phantom fighter was beginning. With the collapse of Corregidor, the archipelago entered its darkest chapter. Yet it was precisely in this darkness that establishing the resistance network began. The narrative now shifts dramatically from the formal, visible war to the invisible one. You are now one of the young officers who slipped away. Or perhaps a dedicated civilian, suddenly realizing that the government you trusted is gone and survival depends entirely on self-reliance and community trust. The immediate challenge is coordination. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese forces initially concentrated on clearing the major islands, and securing port cities were completely unable to effectively occupy the vast mountainous and heavily forested interiors of the 7,000-plus islands. This geographic reality became the single greatest asset for the nascent resistance. The Japanese controlled the cities and the main roads. The guerrillas controlled everything else, especially the night. Imagine the atmosphere in the weeks following the formal surrender. Everyone is watching everyone else. Neighbors you thought you knew might be Japanese collaborators, the Makapili, or they might be covert intelligence gatherers. Trust is currency, and it is in dangerously short supply. The initial resistance groups were entirely fragmented. Small bands of bypassed U.S. soldiers, stray Filipino scouts, provincial police, and highly motivated farmers. They were hiding, not fighting, simply trying to secure food and avoid capture. The great work of this period was the slow, painstaking process of linking these isolated cells. This required an almost impossible level of communication across vast, jungle-covered territories with no working phone lines and with enemy patrols actively sweeping the area. Runners, using ancient trails and sheer local knowledge, became the vital arteries of the resistance. They carried small, tightly folded notes, often written in complex local dialects or simple coded language, risking execution if caught. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this organization period involves the incredible resourcefulness used to maintain some semblance of financial structure. Since the Japanese had replaced the pre-war currency with their own occupation script, which the guerrillas naturally dubbed Mickey Mouse money because of its lack of value, the resistance often relied on printing their own emergency guerrilla notes, sometimes based on promises of reimbursement from the U.S. government after the war. These notes, often crude and signed by local provincial governors who had refused to surrender, maintained a surprisingly high level of trust among the populace, allowing for basic economic transactions. Rice for bullets, chickens for medical supplies that circumvented the Japanese system. You realize the war wasn't just fought with guns, it was also fought with promissory notes and shared faith in a future liberation. The formation of the resistance wasn't just military, it was deeply political and administrative. Many local officials, mayors, governors, and judges also refused to recognize the Japanese authority and slipped into the mountains. They effectively maintained a shadow government, collecting taxes, usually in kind, like food, and administering justice, providing a critical layer of legitimacy to the armed fighters. Historians still argue whether the Hakbalahap, the communist anti-Japanese group centered in central Luzon, represented a vital parallel resistance front that was systematically ignored by the US-backed guerrilla forces, or whether their political goals created an unnecessary division that actually hindered the unified war effort against the Japanese. The debate highlights the complex, multi-layered nature of the resistance, which was never a single monolithic entity, but a tapestry woven from diverse motives and ideologies. You start to recognize the specific contours of this shadow war. Intelligence gathering becomes paramount. Farmers working the rice paddies become spotters, signaling the movement of Japanese columns with subtle shifts in their posture or field arrangements. Fishermen become messengers, using their small boats to ferry supplies and personnel between islands under the cover of darkness. Every civilian is a potential combatant, a scout, or a spy. The initial task of these embryonic groups was simple: survive. The next task was attrition. They needed to find a way to hit the enemy where they were strongest, and for the Japanese, their strength lay in their motorized movement and armor. Standard guerrilla tactics ambush and fade were effective against infantry, but what do you do when a tank rolls down the road? You need something that can stop steel with wood, something that harnesses the very environment the enemy is trying to conquer. The man who would solve this impossible equation was already laying the groundwork for his own private, deeply strategic war in the central Visayas. He understood that tanks are only powerful when they can move, and if you can't penetrate the armor, you can certainly disable the treads and tires. The stage is set, the resistance is forming, and now you are about to meet the man, Colonel Macario Peralta. The story of this impossible weapon is intrinsically tied to the sheer will and strategic brilliance of this single pivotal figure. By the time the formal surrender occurred, Peralta was a young, highly decorated officer, a graduate of the Philippine Constabulary Academy, possessing a sharp legal mind and an even sharper understanding of military logistics. He was one of those individuals who had received the unofficial order to keep fighting. Instead of hiding or joining the march, Peralta, then a major, retreated to Panay Island, one of the central islands in the Visayas group. This location was crucial, as it was centrally located but initially less dense with Japanese troops than Luzon. You can imagine him arriving not as a defeated man, but as a general without an army, carrying nothing but a few meager supplies and the vast weight of his responsibilities. A mainstream historical fact about Peralta is that he was incredibly successful in consolidating authority. Within months of the Japanese occupation, he managed to unite and lead virtually all of the independent guerrilla groups scattered across Panay and Negros Islands, eventually creating the 6th Military District, USAFFE, which became a unified, functioning government. This wasn't just a band of rebels, it was an entire shadow government, complete with military ranks, established currency, those Mickey Mouse avoiding notes, and courts. His success lay not just in fighting, but in administration. He brought order to chaos, convincing disparate, often rival local leaders to work under a centralized command structure. Peralta's primary problem, and the genesis of our story, was mobility. His forces were growing, but the Japanese maintained control over the main lines of communication, the coastal roads, and the few inland highways. Whenever a significant guerrilla action occurred, the Japanese response was swift and terrifying. Armored columns, often led by light tanks or heavily protected trucks, would roar out of their garrisons quickly, overwhelming the lightly armed guerrillas and executing reprisals against local villages. You realize Peralta needed a way to neutralize the enemy's technological advantage. He knew he couldn't acquire howitzers or anti-tank guns. He couldn't even reliably get enough dynamite. His resources were limited to what the jungle provided and what his people could forge. His philosophy was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Don't try to beat them at their game, force them to play yours. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Peralta's initial command is the story of how he established his radio communications. Recognizing the absolute necessity of intelligence and contact with Allied forces, he used remnants of salvaged pre-war commercial radio equipment, powered often by bicycle generators, to create an operational radio station, call sign KZGZ. This station, broadcasting from a hidden jungle bunker, not only communicated with General MacArthur in Australia, sending crucial intelligence, but also broadcast defiant messages of hope to the Filipino people. Often signing off with patriotic musical numbers, this ability to project authority and connect across the vast Pacific was a stunning feat of improvisation. It's hard enough getting Wi-Fi in the jungle today. Imagine setting up a shortwave radio network in 1942 while being hunted by an army. Peralta's focus was relentless innovation. He gathered around him a motley crew of engineers, blacksmiths, and, most importantly, local laborers who intimately understood the land. He wasn't just looking for explosives, he was looking for friction, for disruption, for something that was non-metallic and thus immune to the enemy's developing, if rudimentary mine detection sweeps. Historians still argue whether Peralta's extremely disciplined, almost conventional military approach insisting on uniforms, ranks, and strict adherence to the laws of war, even as a guerrilla, was more beneficial for post-war recognition and Allied cooperation, or if a more radical decentralized structure would have allowed for greater tactical flexibility in the field. His insistence on discipline, however, helped forge the organization that would eventually produce the anti-tank Spike. He posed the challenge to his people. How do we stop the steel behemoths using only what grows here? The answer needed to be simple, scalable, and impossible for the enemy to detect until it was too late. This was the intellectual and operational crucible from which the legendary bamboo anti-tank trap would emerge. You can see the brainstorming sessions in the dark jungle camps, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth as men sketch crude designs in the mud, trying to find the point of intersection between a plant and a tank tread. The problem facing Peralta and his newly consolidated 6th Military District was not infantry, which his growing guerrilla army could handle in Hitondran ambushes, but the relentless, intimidating presence of the problem, Japanese mechanized cavalry. You observe the fear these machines instilled. The Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank, the workhorse of the early campaigns, might seem undergunned by late war standards, but in the Philippine theater, it was an overwhelming force multiplier. A tank represented not just firepower, but psychological dominance. A mainstream historical fact is that the rapid deployment of armor, particularly the Type 97 medium tanks and the lighter Type 95s, was a key factor in shattering the organized American and Filipino defensive lines in Luzon. These tanks, while relatively thin-skinned compared to their later European counterparts, were impervious to the .30 caliber rifles and old .45 pistols that made up the vast majority of the guerrilla arsenal. Imagine being a young guerrilla fighter hidden in the roadside brush. You hear the clanking, grinding sound of those treads approaching. You know that if you fire your rifle, you might wound the accompanying infantry, but the tank itself will simply keep moving, sweeping the area with machine gun fire and then calling in heavy support. There is no escape, no cornering a tank. They symbolize the futility of resistance. The Japanese used their mechanized cavalry as a mobile shield and swift counterattack force. They didn't need to occupy every village. They only needed to show that they could arrive quickly and violently anywhere they were challenged. Every successful ambush of an infantry patrol was immediately met with a punitive armored column, designed to erase the resistance and terrorize the civilian population into compliance. Peralta recognized that stopping the armor was the key to gaining operational freedom. If the tanks couldn't move quickly, their strategic value plummeted. But how do you stop a 15-ton steel box? You couldn't rely on conventional weapons. The Allied supply chain was non-existent. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the initial, rather desperate attempts by some early resistance groups to improvise anti-tank weapons. Tales abound of guerrillas stacking logs or filling culverts with rocks, hoping to overturn the lighter tanks. More dramatically, some groups attempted to use salvaged, unexploded naval shells as massive improvised landmines, which often resulted in catastrophic failure for the guerrillas themselves due to unstable fuses or premature detonation. You might chuckle at the idea of trying to roll a giant rock in front of a tank, but this highlights the sheer lack of options available to them. It truly was a struggle of intelligence against material superiority. The necessity of finding a non-explosive, non-metallic anti-tank weapon became paramount. Anything metallic would quickly be identified and neutralized by Japanese engineers, who were learning fast from their occasional encounters with salvaged ordnance. The solution had to be organic, abundant, and easily concealed. It also had to be cheap and manufacturable by untrained villages, a weapon that could be produced on an industrial scale. But using pre-industrial tools, historians still argue whether the guerrilla focus on disrupting Japanese mobility rather than attempting to destroy the tanks outright was a sign of ingenious strategic thinking based on resource limitation or simply a forced constraint that they made the best of. Regardless, the effect was the same. The shift in strategy forced the Japanese to slow down, to dedicate significant engineering assets to road clearing, and to constantly fear the ground beneath their tires. Peralta knew the vulnerability of the machines was not the armor itself, but the tires and treads that connected them to the ground. A tank track is a complex, sensitive piece of machinery. If you break a link or tear a tread, the entire machine becomes a static artillery piece, unable to pursue or threaten the fleeting resistance, and tires used on accompanying scout cars and supply trucks were inherently vulnerable to simple puncture. You begin to appreciate the elegance of the solution that was slowly forming in Peralta's mind. The most abundant, hardest, fastest-growing plant in the Philippines was about to be weaponized. It was a perfect, local answer to a global technological problem. The enemy's speed was their weakness, and the slow, quiet jungle was about to extract a crushing toll. This was the moment where Macario Peralta stopped thinking like a conventional officer and started thinking like a true jungle engineer. The realization that steel must be fought with wood was born out of the supply chain nightmare. You are now intimately familiar with the desperate logistical situation facing Peralta's 6th Military District. They were not only isolated geographically, but practically cut off from any outside source of modern military supplies. Every bullet, every roll of gauze, every dry sill battery had to be scavenged, stolen, or somehow acquired through highly dangerous covert means. A mainstream historical fact underpinning this nightmare is the American forces' policy of destroying or dumping massive quantities of equipment, ammunition, and stores into the sea or into deep pits prior to the surrender of Botan and Corregidor, specifically to deny them to the Japanese. While strategically sound in theory, this left the subsequent guerrilla movement starting from scratch. You realize that a few dedicated groups risked their lives diving into the murky waters of Manila Bay, trying to recover submerged, rusting rifles and ammo cases, a truly desperate measure. The immediate need for anti-tank weaponry was impossible to fulfill. Standard-issue anti-tank mines were heavy, highly explosive, and required sophisticated detonators, all of which were unavailable. Even if they managed to scrounge up enough TNT, they lacked the specialized fusing mechanisms needed to ensure detonation under the pressure of a tank tread. The Japanese occupation tightened security around any known ordnance dumps, making recovery exponentially harder. Peralta understood the cost-benefit ratio immediately. Acquiring one anti-tank rifle might take months, and it would only fire a handful of rounds before the weapon was either lost or ran out of ammunition. He needed a permanent, reusable, easily replaceable system that used zero imported components. The answer had to be indigenous, or the resistance would be crushed by the first few armored sweeps. This environmental constraint forced innovation. The guerrilla engineers began studying the Japanese vehicles not as impenetrable fortresses, but as machines with specific points of failure. The common weak point for all mechanized transport tanks, trucks, and armored cars was the rubber tires, the tracks, and the relatively soft underside components, like fuel tanks and oil pans. They weren't looking to obliterate the tank, just immobilize it, turning its heavy armor into a liability by making it a sitting duck for further ambushes by infantry armed with firebombs or lunge mines when those became available much later. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the guerrilla adaptation of coconut husks. In areas where they lacked any metal or chemical means of ignition, resistance fighters would sometimes use dried coconut husks, soaked in kerosene or animal fat, as slow-burning makeshift incendiary devices. These were often dropped from overpasses onto passing supply trucks, not to cause an immediate explosion, but to start a slow, persistent fire in the engine or cargo bay, leveraging the tropical heat and humidity to ensure maximum destruction. This exemplifies the mentality, using every single local item as a potential weapon. The focus narrowed to the one material that grew everywhere, was incredibly hard, and could be sharpened to a razor-fine point: bamboo. Historians still argue whether the invention of the bamboo spike traps, specifically the Sutsa design we'll detail next, was the product of pure engineering genius within Peralta's inner circle, or if it was an ancient, localized anti-personnel trap design that was simply scaled up and adapted for modern mechanized targets. Regardless of its origin, the crucial innovation was its application against armor. The idea was elegantly simple: use the vehicle's own enormous weight and momentum against it, driving a hardened point upwards with enough force to breach the vulnerable parts. You can picture Peralta in the light of a flickering oil lamp, watching a demonstration of how a properly fire-hardened bamboo spike could puncture thick leather or even a thin sheet of galvanized metal. He realized that the ground clearance on the Japanese tanks and trucks was surprisingly low, and the tracks, while tough, were simply a series of exposed, bolted-together metal segments. If a spike could pierce the rubber tire of a supply truck, or worse, shear the tracks of a Type 95 tank. They had a winner. It was the absolute necessity born of this supply chain nightmare that gave birth to the weapon. Peralta's solution depended entirely on local knowledge. Global war. You realize that the technological imbalance could only be countered by leveraging the profound intimacy the Filipino people had with their environment. The jungle wasn't just a place to hide, it was an armory, a fortress, and a dispensary, all rolled into one impossibly dense landscape. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese forces, despite their training and discipline, were notoriously ill-suited for sustained jungle warfare in the deep interior. They relied heavily on established roads and supply lines, making them predictable. Their doctrine was designed for mechanized advance across open terrain, not for endless skirmishes against an enemy who could vanish into the dense foliage within seconds. This fundamental difference in environmental understanding became the guerrillas' greatest strategic advantage. The shift in warfare meant prioritizing materials that were locally abundant. Bamboo, scientifically known as bambusa, or Schistosocium species, grows everywhere in the Philippines. It is fast-growing, incredibly strong, it has a higher tensile strength than many varieties of steel, and is exceptionally lightweight. And, crucially, its cellular structure allows it to be sharpened to a durable point. The resistance fighters didn't need a factory. They needed a sustainable bamboo grove, a few fires, and a lot of dedicated hands. You observe the guerrilla engineers learning from local agricultural and hunting traditions. Farmers and tribesmen had long used sharpened bamboo stakes, sutsat, or similar terms depending on the region, as traditional anti-personnel traps in hunting paths or around villages to deter predators. The knowledge of how to cut the bamboo at the optimal node, how to achieve a perfect triangular cross-section for maximum penetrating power, and how to fire-harden the tip to make it almost ceramicer. This was centuries of local engineering genius immediately available to the war effort. A quirky or fringe tidbit involved the use of plant toxins. Some resistance groups, particularly in the more remote regions, experimented with coating the tips of the bamboo spikes with naturally occurring poisons derived from local trees or even snake venom. Though the effectiveness and consistency of this method were highly debated and difficult to control. The idea wasn't necessarily to kill the Japanese soldier outright, but to guarantee a crippling infection or severe incapacitation from even a minor wound, adding another layer of terror and complexity to routine road sweeps. You can imagine the psychological effect, stepping on a stick that not only hurts but might slowly poison you. This fusion of ancient knowledge and modern necessity was key. The sutsat design wasn't invented out of whole cloth. It was an evolution. Peralta's men took the existing concept of the spike trap and adapted its dimensions, hardening techniques, and deployment methodology specifically to target mechanized vehicle components, the soft underbelly, the oil reservoir, and the vulnerable tire sidewall. Historians still argue whether the sutsat spike traps contributed more to slowing Japanese logistical movements or to bolstering the Filipino civilian morale and participation in the war effort. Was the primary value material destruction? Or was it the powerful narrative that the common Filipino could, with their own hands and local resources, strike a crippling blow against the technologically advanced invader? Both roles were vital, but the psychological impact of seeing an enemy tank stopped by a stick cannot be overstated. You understand that this was a war fought on the enemy's timeline, but with the guerrillas' tools. Every time a Japanese vehicle hit a bamboo trap, it was a victory not just for the resistance fighters, but for the entire community that harvested, sharpened, and buried those spikes. It affirmed that their knowledge, their land, and their simple labor held the power to defeat the metallic invaders. The ground itself was being weaponized, and the Japanese, despite their tanks and planes, were constantly at the mercy of the soil they occupied. The next step was transforming this brilliant concept into a mass-produced weapon of war. The conceptual idea of using bamboo now had to transition into a standardized lethal weapon, the birth of the sutsat trap. You joined the resistance workshops, often hidden deep within bamboo groves or under dense jungle canopies. Where the process of mass-producing this unconventional anti-tank device was perfected, a mainstream historical fact is that the name sutsat, or sometimes sutset, is a Visayan term, derived from a word that often means to stab or to pierce, which speaks directly to the weapon's function. This was not a sophisticated factory operation. It was a decentralized cottage industry of resistance. The design that emerged was highly specialized. The target was no longer a human foot, but the heavy pressure areas of a vehicle, tires, fuel tanks, and especially the relatively thin steel plates protecting the underside of a tank's hull and the vulnerable undercarriage components. The preferred type of bamboo was often the giant bamboo species, known for its thick walls and incredibly hard fibers. The men would select pieces from the lower nodes of the stalk, where the wood was densest and the fibers were most mature. The cutting was done with precision, using sharp machetes or locally forged blades, creating stakes approximately 18 to 24 inches in length. This length was critical, ensuring the spike was long enough to penetrate deep and be firmly anchored into the ground, but short enough to remain rigid under the tremendous pressure of a passing vehicle. You watch the painstaking labor of the sharpening process. The final 3 to 4 inches were honed into a needle-sharp point, often utilizing the natural angle of the bamboo's cross-section. Then came the most crucial part, fire hardening. This quirky or fringe tidbit is what elevated the sutsat from a simple stick to a truly effective weapon. The tips of the spikes were carefully placed into a slow-burning fire, or sometimes charred over coals, then quickly quenched. This process of charring and rapid cooling dried out the sap, crystallized the outer cellulose fibers, and created a tip that was incredibly brittle, yet rock-hard like a piece of obsidian. This hardened tip could maintain its sharpness even when driven into hard rubber or thin steel. The final assembly involved anchoring the spikes. They were typically buried in dense formations, planted almost vertically or at a very slight angle, so that the passing vehicle's weight would drive them straight up. The most ingenious version of the trap involved planting the spikes in pits or trenches, often covered with a thin layer of earth and debris, ensuring they were completely invisible. Historians still argue whether the sutsat was primarily designed to breach the tank treads, which required hitting a very specific, vulnerable section of the track links, or if its greater success was against the tires and fuel tanks of the lighter supply and personnel trucks that always accompanied the armor. Regardless, the standardization of the technique allowed Peralta to order production on a massive scale. Villages were tasked with producing hundreds, sometimes thousands of these spikes in weekly quotas, transforming entire communities into covert armament workshops. You realize the profound simplicity. The weapon had no moving parts, required no specialized training beyond local woodworking skills, and its raw material was abundant and free. A single man could carry dozens of these lethal spikes, and a platoon of guerrillas could deploy a field of hundreds in a single night. This industrial-scale production of an organic weapon gave the 6th Military District an anti-tank capability that was exponentially greater and more sustainable than any conventional ordnance they could hope to acquire. This simple tool was the great equalizer. It turned the heavy, cumbersome weight of the Japanese armor from an advantage into a massive vulnerability. Every time a tank rolled out of a garrison, it was driving its hundreds of tons of force directly down onto the hardened points, waiting beneath the surface. It was a purely defensive, airy-denial weapon that completely redefined the tactical map of the vicinity. The simple act of sharpening a stick became an act of high-stakes wartime engineering, culminating in engineering the lethality. You are now focused on the specific, almost fanatical attention to detail that transformed the bamboo spike from a nuisance into a weapon, capable of disabling an armored vehicle. The key to lethality lay in optimizing the interaction between the soft organic material and the hard metal of the enemy vehicle. A mainstream historical fact is that even the seemingly robust metal used in early Japanese armored vehicles, particularly the Type 95 light tank, was relatively thin by later World War II standards. The whole floor plate could be as thin as 6 millimeters of steel. While this was sufficient to stop small arms fire, it was not designed to withstand a focused, immense upward force. Peralta's engineers understood the physics. P equals AF, where P is the pressure, F is the force, the weight of the tank and its momentum, and A is the area over which the force is distributed, the tip of the spike. By minimizing the area A through meticulous sharpening and maximizing the force, F using the tank's own weight, they could achieve a pressure P high enough to breach steel. The sharpening technique, therefore, was paramount. The spikes were not merely whittled, they were carved to a multifaceted point, often triangular in cross-section, maximizing the concentration of force. The fire hardening process, already mentioned, was refined to ensure the tip was hard enough to withstand the initial impact without buckling. If the tip softened, the energy would be absorbed, and the spike would simply splinter. By hardening it, the energy was directed entirely at the point of penetration. You look closely at the meticulously prepared tips. They have a dark, almost glassy appearance where the heat has transformed the surface fibers. This quirky or fringe tidbit of engineering ingenuity involved the use of certain natural glues and resins, often derived from local tree sap, applied near the base of the spike. This wasn't for adherence to the ground. It was to slightly increase the stiffness of the spike's body, preventing lateral sway or snapping when the enormous weight of a tank hit it off-center. They were essentially giving the spike a tiny hidden structural support system. The most critical factor was the deployment angle. The spikes were not planted straight up like fence posts. They were installed in large clusters, often staggered at an angle of between 70 to 80 degrees relative to the road surface. This angle ensured that the leading edge of the tank track or tire would catch the tip and drive the spike inward rather than pushing it over. It was like creating a dense field of upward-pointing chisels, waiting for the heavy vehicle to self. Historians still argue whether the Suitsot achieved more immobilization by breaching the track links and road wheels, leading to catastrophic mechanical failure, or by puncturing the low-pressure tires of the accompanying supply trucks and armored cars, leading to immediate immobility and creating a bottleneck for the whole column. Both outcomes were devastating. But the success against the track links of the lighter Type 95 tank is particularly impressive, representing a true organic counter to a machine of steel. This weapon, manufactured in thousands by simple villagers, represented a perfect example of applied, localized physics. You realize that the Japanese engineers designing the tank armor never considered a fire-hardened bamboo spike as a threat. They worried about mortar and mines. They didn't account for the relentless ingenuity of men who had nothing but their land and their will to fight. The next challenge would be deployment making. Sure, the invisible trap was perfectly placed where it could deliver its full, engineered lethality. The production was solved. Now came the operational challenge: deployment and camouflage tactics. You are out on the muddy jungle roads at night, shoulder to shoulder with a team of guerrilla engineers, learning the painstaking process of installing the Suitsot traps. The success of the weapon depended entirely on its invisibility. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese forces, once in occupation, prioritized securing and maintaining control of key road networks and bridges. These roads, often the only paths capable of handling heavy vehicle traffic, became the predictable arteries for their patrols and supply columns. The guerrillas knew the enemy would travel along these routes, and they focused their efforts on three specific high-value locations: areas just past river crossings where vehicles often slowed down or were already stressed, sharp bends in the road where drivers naturally decelerated, and choke points where the road narrowed due to terrain. The camouflage technique was a mastery of natural deception. The spikes were typically planted in wide, dense patches, covering the entire width of the usable road surface. The key was the concealment layer. You watch as a thin, often woven mat of dried grass, large leaves, or flexible bamboo sheeting is placed over the field of spikes. This mat held the necessary covering material, a very light layer of the road's native soil, mud or gravel, just enough to completely hide the lethal tips, but not so much that it would cushion the impact of a vehicle. The genius lay in the non-metallic nature of the trap. The Japanese, expecting conventional mines, began employing crude forms of minesweeping, often involving long poles or even pushing native laborers ahead of the columns. But the Suitsot spike, being entirely organic, save for the microscopic crystallization of the tip, passed undetected by the enemy's rudimentary metallic sweeps. You notice a crucial, quirky or fringe tidbit in the technique. The deployment teams often scattered a few pieces of natural common jungle, debris fallen fruit, large, oddly shaped rocks, or clumps of mutter on the edges of the patch. This wasn't just camouflage. It was intended to subtly condition the Japanese driver or scout to dismiss the area as naturally messy. They were intentionally making the road look neglected and normal, rather than pristine and suspicious. It's a psychological tactic. The enemy assumes a cleared road is safe, but a messy, debris-strewn road is just a normal, difficult jungle road. The labor was exhausting and carried an immense risk. The teams had to work in absolute silence, often only during the darkest hours between midnight and dawn. And they had to clear every trace of their presence footprints, discarded tools, or any unnatural arrangement of the vegetation. Discovery meant instant execution, not just for the guerrillas, but often for the nearest village suspected of complicity. Historians still argue whether the primary intention of the suitsat was actually to disable the armor itself, or if it was more focused on disrupting the Japanese logistics and supply chain by puncturing the tires of fuel, food, and troop transport trucks. The guerrillas forced the Japanese to dedicate massive resources to vehicle maintenance, tire replacement, and road security. Every disabled truck meant a hungry, slow, or stalled column, which in a guerrilla war is almost as good as destroying the lead tank. You realize the profound impact of this decentralized covert deployment. A handful of men could, in a single night, render 5 kilometers of a major road impassable for mechanized traffic. The production was rapid, the deployment was simple, and the weapon was undetectable. The next step, the moment of truth, was waiting for the terrifying rumble of an approaching mechanized column to announce the arrival of the enemy's own executioner. The clock is ticking, the jungle is silent, and you hold your breath as the first patrol approaches. The theory, the engineering, and the deployment methods have all been perfected, and now you stand witness to the first strike, a scouting column. The tension is electric, the air so thick you feel you could cut it with a machete. You are hidden deep in the undergrowth, heart hammering against your ribs, as the deep, distant grind of internal combustion engines grows steadily louder. The column approaches with confidence. It's a standard reconnaissance patrol, a lead armored car, perhaps a Type 93, followed by 2 medium-sized supply trucks carrying infantry and provisions, and a final jeep or motorcycle team acting as the rear guard. They are moving fast, comfortable in the knowledge that they control the roads and possess superior firepower. This cockiness is exactly what Peralta's men counted on. A mainstream historical fact is that Japanese military doctrine initially emphasized speed and offensive momentum. Their patrols were often complacent on secured roads, relying on the sheer impossibility of the lightly armed guerrillas mounting a serious threat to armor. They expected resistance, but only in the form of small arms fire, which their vehicles were designed to shrug off. They certainly weren't expecting a coordinated non-metallic countermeasure. The lead armored car hits the first spike field. The sound is not the massive explosion of a landmine, but a sharp, sickening thwack crunch, immediately followed by a scraping metallic whine. The heavy vehicle lurches violently to one side as the pressure of its front tire drives a cluster of fire-hardened bamboo spikes deep into the rubber and, crucially, through the thin wheel well plate. The spike, leveraged by the vehicle's enormous momentum, acts like a massive needle, penetrating far enough to score the brake lines or, in some cases, the vulnerable steering mechanism. The driver, confused and unable to comprehend the nature of the attack, slams on the brakes. You watch the supply trucks immediately following pile up, as they are now forced to apply massive braking force on the very road surface the guerrillas want them to stop on. One of the heavy trucks, unable to stop in time, slams its tires right into a second, denser cluster of soot spikes. The sound of 4 tires simultaneously shredding is surprisingly loud, like tearing an enormous canvas sail. The result is immediate chaos, not fiery destruction. The column is instantly immobilized, the armored car is crippled and listing. The truck is dead in the water, its mission impossible to continue. The Japanese infantry, startled by the sudden mechanical failure rather than a conventional ambush, spills out of the trucks, unsure of the threat's source. They are now static, confused, and vulnerably exactly where the guerrillas wanted them. Here, a quirky or fringe tidbit from the early engagements emerges. The spikes often caused a slow, frustrating immobilization rather than an instantaneous stop. The armored car, for example, might be able to limp forward 100 meters on its punctured tire before the rim was completely destroyed. This delay was tactically crucial, as it allowed the trailing supply trucks to get closer, maximizing the density of the target area before the column realized the true nature of the trap. The guerrillas weren't looking for a quick kill, they were looking for a traffic jam. The ambush sequence then unfolds as the Japanese infantry sets up a perimeter, trying to locate the source of the attack. The guerrilla riflemen open fire from concealed positions. The fight shifts from a mechanized confrontation to a brutal infantry engagement, where the trapped Japanese are exposed and fighting in an unfamiliar environment against an unseen enemy. Historians still argue whether the primary strategic impact of the Suitsat was the material damage it caused, or the successful test of the resistance's operational security and coordination. The fact that hundreds of spikes could be planted and a heavy column could be ambushed without any internal Japanese intelligence. Leaking the plan proved that Peralta's network was robust, disciplined, and virtually impenetrable. You see the profound effect of the bamboo. It didn't kill the column, but it disabled it, turning a speedy, confident patrol into a vulnerable, demoralized target. The initial success was not just a victory, it was proof of concept. The Japanese would soon realize that the very ground they occupied was now weaponized against them, and the simple bamboo stick was their enemy's most effective weapon. The success of the first strikes sent shockwaves through the local Japanese command, forcing the Japanese response. Countermeasures. You observe the immediate shift in enemy behavior from confident patrol to cautious, deliberate movement. The Japanese military, being highly disciplined and analytical, quickly realized they were facing a unique, pervasive, and highly frustrating threat. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese forces initially attributed the vehicle damage to primitive, highly camouflaged mines, or perhaps highly localized sabotage. However, the lack of detonation, evidence, or metallic residue, combined with reports of clean, upward-driven punctures, soon led their engineers to understand the true nature of the weapon. They were dealing with organic materials, which instantly complicated their existing sweep procedures. The first countermeasure was increased vigilance. Patrols slowed down dramatically, moving at a snail's pace. Infantry were ordered to march far ahead of the vehicles, meticulously prodding the road surface with bayonets and long sticks. This was exactly what Peralta wanted. It drastically reduced the speed and efficiency of the Japanese response, turning what should have been a quick 2-hour patrol into an entire day's arduous ordeal. The roads became hostile territory, and the cost of travel increased exponentially. The enemy then moved to more technical, if still rudimentary, solutions. You see the development of makeshift road-clearing implements. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of heavy wooden rollers, sometimes studded with metal spikes, towed ahead of the lead armored vehicle. The idea was that the roller would either crush the concealed bamboo spikes or detonate any genuine landmines. However, the Suitsat was often too deeply and rigidly planted to be crushed by the weight of a simple roller. And the Japanese soon realized they were damaging their own expensive road-clearing equipment on simple sticks. Furthermore, the guerrillas adapted by planting the spikes outside the path of the roller, targeting the unprotected space beneath the track, skirt, or the wheels of the accompanying trucks. The Japanese also attempted to impose draconian collective punishment on villages near any successful spike attack, burning homes and executing suspected sympathizers. While this terrorized the population, it often backfired strategically. Instead of discouraging resistance, it hardened the resolve of the villagers, pushing even more people into the arms of the guerrillas and cementing the total lack of cooperation with the Japanese occupation. Historians still argue whether the most strategically damaging aspect of the Suitsat traps was the material cost of replacing tires and repairing tracks, or the immense time cost associated with the reduced patrol speed and constant road clearance. The reduction in patrol velocity was critical. It gave the guerrillas more time to set up ambushes, more time to move supplies, and more time to escape before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. Essentially, the spikes were transforming the Japanese army from a highly mobile force into a slow-moving, road-bound convoy. The ingenuity of Peralta's men was now locked in an innovation feedback loop with the Japanese. Every countermeasure was studied. If the Japanese pushed native laborers to walk ahead of the columns, the guerrillas began planting lighter, non-vehicle Suitsat or similar anti-personnel traps in the roadside verges, forcing the Japanese soldiers themselves to clear the paths further, slowing their progress and increasing their casualties. You realize that the war in the Visayas had devolved into a silent subterranean battle for the road surface. The enemy was spending massive amounts of time and energy trying to clear a path, only to find the same simple, undetectable weapon waiting a few kilometers down the road. The bamboo spike was not a weapon of annihilation, but a brilliant, strategic tool of delay and area denial, effectively reducing the Japanese army's operational range and demoralizing the troops, who now had to fear every step and every meter of progress. The tactical contest over the road networks entered a new, deadlier phase characterized by escalation, tank versus tuber. As the Japanese countermeasures became more elaborate, the Filipino guerrillas under Peralta responded with increasing complexity and ruthlessness, blending the simple sutsat with other ingenious, locally manufactured devices. A mainstream historical fact is that genuine conventional landmines were almost non-existent in the guerrilla arsenal. However, the Japanese preoccupation with mine detection became a weapon itself. The guerrillas realized they could exploit the enemy's fear of explosives by pairing the undetectable bamboo spikes with improvised explosive devices, i.e., these IEDs were typically Molotov cocktails or Tinkin grenades using scavenged powder and homemade fuses, or sometimes highly unstable explosives salvaged from unexploded Japanese ordnance. The technique was often a layered trap. You are watching a team deploy the new escalation. The first layer consists of the dense, anti-vehicle sutsat spikes, designed to puncture tires and immobilize the lead truck or armored car. Then, often deployed just behind the spike field, would be a rudimentary pressure-recavated charge. This charge wasn't necessarily meant to destroy the tank, but to detonate when a following infantry patrol, moving forward to secure the disabled vehicle, stepped on it. A critical, quirky, or fringe tidbit involved the use of non-metallic anti-personnel traps deployed alongside the anti-tank spikes, often designed to maximize chaos. One common horrifying device was the booby trap hole lined with thin bamboo skewers, sometimes coated in feces or mud to ensure instant infection, a strategy designed to tie up Japanese medical resources. These traps were specifically placed in the verges and shoulders of the road, the very spots where Japanese infantry would jump off their trucks to investigate the immobilized armor. By targeting the infantry responding to the disabled vehicle, the guerrillas made every successful sutsat strike a multi-layered nightmare for the Japanese column. The term tank versus tuber relates to the use of primitive, non-metallic pressure switches. In areas where they did manage to acquire small amounts of high explosive, the guerrillas struggled with reliable non-metallic detonators. They experimented with various indigenous materials to create triggers, including meticulously carved wooden pressure plates, and even dried sections of certain local tubers or roots that would crush under the weight of a vehicle completing a circuit or triggering a simple mechanical release. This highlights the absolute desperation for non-metallic solutions to bypass Japanese sweeps. Historians still argue whether the Sutsa-esque's greatest contribution was forcing the Japanese to dedicate valuable engineers and resources away from offensive operations and into purely defensive road-clearing roles, or whether the traps' main value was in creating the perfect conditions for conventional ambushes. The debate centers on the resource drain. Every day, the Japanese spent replacing truck tires, repairing track links, and clearing roads was a day they weren't pursuing the high command. You realize the profound psychological warfare at play. The combination of the silent, invisible spikes and the possibility of a hidden explosive or infectious trap meant that the simple act of marching down a road became a terrifying lottery for the Japanese soldiers. They were not just fighting visible enemies, they were fighting the ground itself. Every step was a risk, every kilometer earned through sheer, painstaking vigilance. This psychological toll was arguably more effective than any individual mechanical failure caused by a bamboo spike. The constant, gnawing fear of the unknown, the fear of a stick that can stop a tank, was the greatest weapon Peralta forged. The war waged by the invisible, organic weapon had a devastating cumulative effect, primarily manifesting in the impact on Japanese morale and movement. You observe how the consistent, unpredictable threat of the sutsat traps began to erode the confidence and discipline of the occupying forces, turning their technological superiority into a source of frustration. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese military's rapid, almost unbroken string of victories across Southeast Asia bred a sense of invincibility. The sudden anonymous casualties and mechanical failures in the Philippines, caused by simple, unseen stakes, were deeply demoralizing. Soldiers were trained to fight a recognizable, uniformed enemy. They were not prepared for a war against the landscape itself. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being a Japanese driver or an accompanying infantryman. Every kilometer on the road required excruciating slowness and constant, meticulous prodding. The anxiety wasn't about a massive ambush, which you could prepare for. It was about the simple, random puncture that could happen at any moment, turning your expensive armored vehicle into a useless wreck and leaving you vulnerable to an unseen enemy. This constant fear bred fatigue and paranoia. Patrols became less effective because the soldiers were spending more time on road clearance than on actual counter-guerrilla operations. The time taken to travel a standard 50-kilometer route should have taken a couple of hours stretched into an entire day, sometimes two, drastically limiting the Japanese response time and geographic reach. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals the extent of this paranoia. Reports from Japanese garrison logs and recovered documents indicated that soldiers often became convinced that the Filipino population possessed some form of jungle magic or ancient technology that allowed them to disable the machines. This superstitious belief arose because the spikes were entirely non-metallic, and the enemy could rationalize a common stick being capable of crippling a tank tread. This irrational fear further contributed to the troops' psychological breakdown, making them more prone to rash actions and brutal, often counterproductive, reprisals against local villages. The impact on movement was strategic. Peralta's goal was never to defeat the Japanese army outright, but to render the archipelago ungovernable and unoccupable. By denying the enemy easy movement along the main arteries, the Suitset traps effectively forced the Japanese into a static defensive posture around their garrisons and major cities. The resistance could move freely through the interior, establish hidden airstrips, and consolidate their forces, while the Japanese were perpetually confined to the coast and the main roads. Historians still argue whether the highest value of the Suitsat was actually enabling the resistance to establish reliable island-to-island communication and intelligence networks, which were far more crucial to the long-term war effort than localized material damage. The reduced Japanese mobility meant intelligence runners and covert communication teams had a far greater window of opportunity and lower chance of interception. You realize that the true victory of the bamboo spike wasn't the metal it pierced, but the spirit it broke. It turned the proud imperial army into a hesitant, road-bound constabulary, forever looking down at the ground, terrified of the smallest stick. The vast scale of the Philippines, combined with a weapon that could be produced anywhere and deployed by anyone, made the occupation a constant draining exercise in futility. The Japanese had the technology, but the Filipinos owned the ground. The discussion around the effectiveness of the Suitsat often leads to a deeper, more academic question. Historians still argue whether the trap's true strategic impact lay in its physical, destructive capacity or its potent psychological and symbolic value in sustaining the resistance. You are now stepping back from the immediate tactical fight to analyze its historical resonance. A mainstream historical fact is that the total number of Japanese vehicles permanently destroyed by the bamboo spikes alone, without accompanying explosive charges or subsequent rifle fire, was statistically small relative to the overall Japanese inventory. While a single spike could certainly cripple a truck or immobilize a tank, a truly catastrophic total loss of the vehicle usually required follow-up action. However, the counterpoint is that total destruction was never the objective. The objective was disruption and area denial. Crippling a vehicle was often just as effective as destroying it, especially in remote areas where the recovery of a heavy disabled machine was a massive logistical challenge for the Japanese. If a tank was immobilized 10 kilometers down a jungle road, it might take a week to recover, requiring the dedication of dozens of men, expensive maintenance equipment, and continuous security patrols for the entire duration. This massive diversion of resources, caused by a simple stick, represents a colossal strategic victory. The psychological impact, as previously noted, is often cited as the Suitset's greater contribution. The trap was tangible proof that the common Filipino farmer, working in his own backyard with his own materials, could defeat the apex technology of the imperial power. This quirky or fringe tidbit of historical significance provided an enormous boost to civilian morale and recruitment. The story of the tank-stopping stick circulated through the grapevine, amplified by covert resistance radio broadcasts, turning the simple weapon into a potent symbol of indigenous ingenuity and invincibility. It shifted the narrative from "we are helpless against their tanks" to "we can beat their tanks with a sharp stick." The symbolic value was crucial for legitimizing the guerrilla government under Peralta. When a civilian population sees their shadow government successfully waging war and inflicting casualties on the enemy using locally produced, decentralized methods, their faith in that government increases, leading to greater cooperation in intelligence gathering, supply provision, and active resistance. Historians still argue whether the SUTSAT was primarily a symbol that mobilized greater civilian participation, or if its greatest contribution was strictly military, enabling the preservation of the organized guerrilla command by significantly reducing Japanese mobility and response time. The debate is important because it changes how we view asymmetric warfare. Was this a tool of infrastructure sabotage, or was it a powerful piece of psychological warfare? You realize that these two roles are intrinsically linked. The military success of the immobilization fed the propaganda, and the increased morale and participation led to a greater output of the spikes, thus increasing the military success. It was a virtuous cycle of resistance. The bamboo spike wasn't just a weapon, it was a manifesto of defiance, demonstrating that resources could be found even when there were none, and that the sheer will to resist could overcome the most profound technological deficit. It secured the survival of the resistance long enough for outside help to finally arrive. The news of the strange, effective traps eventually traveled through the incredibly challenging communication channels, leading to the American submarine connection. You learn how the ingenious, low-tech solution in the jungle unexpectedly influenced high-level Allied strategic decisions in the Pacific. A mainstream historical fact is that even after the fall of Corregidor, General Douglas MacArthur, having escaped to Australia, maintained his famous pledge, "I shall return." Crucially, he established a sophisticated covert intelligence and supply operation, primarily utilizing American submarines. These subs, running the perilous gauntlet of Japanese patrols, would surface off remote Philippine beaches to offload critical supplies and communications equipment and pick up vital intelligence reports. Peralta's 6th Military District, thanks to his highly disciplined radio operators, was one of the earliest and most reliable sources of intelligence. His reports detailed not only Japanese troop movements and naval patrols, but also the methods the guerrillas were using to fight. You can imagine the look on the face of an intelligence officer in MacArthur's headquarters when he first read a dispatch describing a tank being disabled by a fire-hardened bamboo stick. It must have sounded utterly unbelievable. However, the reports were corroborated by the massive number of incidents, the decline in Japanese patrol efficiency, and the undeniable success of Peralta's overall operations. This quirky or fringe tidbit of military planning involves how the success of the SUTSAT traps influenced the manifestos of the supply submarines. Initially, the Allied command focused on sending standard-issue small arms, ammunition, and medical supplies. But Peralta's reports convinced them that even a small amount of genuine conventional anti-tank weaponry, like specialized armor-piercing grenades or actual anti-tank mines, could be leveraged with devastating effectiveness if the target was already immobilized by the bamboo spikes. The SUTSAT traps, therefore, served as a force multiplier for the few heavy weapons that did arrive. The submarines began delivering small caches of high-grade explosives and specialized anti-tank shells, specifically requested by Peralta's engineers, who understood that their primary task was to stop the tanks with wood and then destroy them with steel. You understand the difficulty of these clandestine operations. Imagine a submarine surfacing miles offshore, a rubber raft carrying crates of highly prized goods paddling to a dark, remote beach, and a handful of silent guerrillas waiting to receive the shipment. They risked discovery capture and the loss of the submarine itself, all to deliver a few crates of supplies that had to be immediately broken down and carried often on the backs of men and carabaos deep into the mountainous interior. Historians still argue whether the sporadic supply drops from the American submarines were more vital. For the material support they provided, for example radios, medicines, a few anti-tank mines, or for the psychological validation they offered, proving to the guerrilla fighters and the Filipino populace that MacArthur and the United States had not forgotten them. The material aid was scarce, but the message, "We are with you, keep fighting," was priceless and fueled the years of resistance. The American connection proved that Peralta's local ingenuity had global ramifications. His simple, organic weapon had validated the entire Philippine resistance movement, ensuring it was not viewed merely as a collection of brigands but as a legitimate, highly effective, and strategically important Allied force, worthy of risking valuable naval assets. The bamboo had earned them a seat at the table of the Pacific War strategy. With the validation and occasional precious supply drops from the Americans, the resistance accelerated its development, entering a phase of beyond bamboo, expanding the trap arsenal. You witness the evolution of the sutsat concept from a purely organic device to a deadly hybrid weapon. Still relying on local ingenuity, but now incorporating scavenged or supplied metallic components, a mainstream historical fact is that the guerrilla forces learned to meticulously strip every disabled Japanese vehicle for useful components. A crippled truck wasn't just a victory, it was a mobile parts depot. They harvested tires to be used for makeshift footwear, slingshots, and even rudimentary waterproofing. Engine parts, and, most importantly, any piece of steel that could be This scavenging ethos allowed the sutsat design to become even more lethal. The most significant upgrade involved the incorporation of sharpened iron rebar, or any piece of high-strength steel that could be forged by local blacksmiths. These metallic spikes, often placed in the center of the dense bamboo fields, were designed to be the kill shot. The surrounding bamboo spikes still performed the critical function of disabling the Japanese mine detectors and providing the initial puncture that stopped the vehicle. However, the steel spike, driven upwards by the weight of a tank, stood a much higher chance of piercing the thicker armor of the hull or puncturing a fuel tank, potentially leading to catastrophic failure. You watch the blacksmiths working covertly, using makeshift bellows and jungle-forged tools, hammering scavenged steel into deadly triangular cross-sections. This transition reveals a crucial step in the evolution of the resistance. They were moving from mere improvisation to sustainable, localized weapons manufacturing. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals their use of repurposed glass. In areas closer to former towns or military camps, the guerrillas began incorporating broken glass shards into their traps. While glass wouldn't stop a tank, they realized that scattering large quantities of broken bottles and windshield glass across the road surface could quickly and silently shred the remaining vulnerable tires of the accompanying support vehicles. This created a secondary layer of anti-logistical defense, maximizing the vehicle damage without increasing the trap's metallic signature. Furthermore, the idea of chemical warfare, which had been debated with the poisoned bamboo tips, remembered the plant toxins, was refined. While they couldn't acquire military-grade poisons, they did focus on contamination. The tips of the spikes, both bamboo and steel, were systematically coated in animal feces, rotting organic matter, or extremely filthy mud. The intention wasn't necessarily immediate death, but to guarantee a deep, raging infection for any soldier who stepped on a spike or who was wounded while trying to clear the disabled vehicle. In the humid, tropical environment, even a small puncture wound could quickly turn gangrenous, tying up Japanese medical supplies and morale. Historians still argue whether the increased lethality provided by the steel and glass additions was worth the increased risk of the traps being detected by Japanese sweeps, which became more sophisticated over time. The careful placement of the metallic components, always hidden beneath the thick carpet of non-metallic bamboo, was a tactical gamble that generally paid off, showing the resistance's ability to evolve and adapt faster than the occupying force. You realize that this expanding arsenal was a direct reflection of Peralta's philosophy: use every available resource, no matter how humble or how filthy, to inflict the maximum possible cost on the enemy. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about bleeding the Japanese occupation dry. One punctured tire, one crippled track, and one festering wound at a time. The cumulative damage was becoming undeniable. The escalating success of the ingenious traps inevitably led to the general's frustration. You observe the mounting pressure and strategic headaches faced by the commander of the Japanese forces in the Philippines. Notably, Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, whose campaign had been delayed and complicated far beyond initial projections. A mainstream historical fact is that General Hama had promised his superiors in Tokyo a swift, decisive victory in the Philippines. The prolonged, unexpected defense of Bataan and Corregidor, and then the ceaseless, highly effective guerrilla warfare that followed, caused him immense personal and professional distress. The sutsat traps, while seemingly insignificant compared to naval engagements or aerial bombing, became a massive symbol of his inability to pacify the islands. The sheer unpredictability of the resistance was driving the Japanese command crazy. Hama had enough conventional forces to crush any large-scale organized army, But he couldn't fight an enemy that wasn't there. The constant reports of immobilized vehicles, shattered supply chains, and demoralized troops due to unknown sabotage piled up on his desk. Every repair and every kilometer of road clearance represented a sunk cost and a strategic delay. Imagine the frustration. You have tanks, planes, and thousands of disciplined soldiers. Yet your most effective combatant is a stick of wood. Hama was forced to divert massive manpower from combat operations to purely security and engineering roles, dedicating entire platoons to the monotonous, dangerous task of road prodding and clearing. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals the extreme measures taken to combat the unseen enemy. To avoid the traps, Hama ordered certain Japanese engineer units to requisition or outright commandeer large numbers of local livestock, specifically Carabao's water buffalo, and force them to walk ahead of the vehicle columns. The idea was that the heavy animals would either detonate a conventional mine or impale themselves on the bamboo spikes, clearing the path at the expense of local resources. This brutal tactic further alienated the civilian population, reinforcing their commitment to the resistance and adding yet another layer to the psychological warfare. The image of the powerful imperial army relying on cattle to clear their path highlights their descent into tactical desperation. The inability to control the Visayas, specifically the islands under Peralta's cohesive command, meant Hama couldn't secure his flanks and rear lines of communication. This forced him to maintain garrisons far larger than strategically necessary. The constant attrition and the continuous flow of high-grade intelligence from Peralta's radio to MacArthur in Australia meant that the entire Philippine occupation remained a bleeding ulcer for the Japanese war machine. Historians still argue whether the guerrilla resistance's success was more due to the Japanese High Command's underestimation of the Filipinos' determination, or if the sheer geographic complexity of the archipelago made any successful occupation logistically impossible. Regardless of the resistance method, the Sutsop traps simply exploited the existing, massive logistical vulnerability presented by the island terrain. You realize that Hama's frustration was justified. He was caught in a trap of his own making. The longer he occupied the islands, the more enemies he created. The more brutally he cracked down, the more determined the people became. And the more tanks he sent down the road, the more bamboo spikes were manufactured to meet them. The simple, locally sourced weapon had successfully transformed a lightning campaign into a grinding, debilitating counterinsurgency war that Hama could not win, ultimately leading to his own removal from command later in the war due to the failure to achieve the required pacification. The relentless production and deployment of the Sutsop traps required a depth of cooperation that extended far beyond the armed fighters, diving deep into civilian integration and risk. You now understand that the bamboo spike was a true weapon of the people, relying on the essential, heroic, and incredibly dangerous participation of local farmers and villagers. A mainstream historical fact is that the Philippine resistance was successful because it was a popular movement. Unlike many guerrilla conflicts, the vast majority of the Filipino civilian population actively supported the resistance, often enduring unimaginable suffering and risk to do so. The Sutsop was the perfect tool for this integration. It was a weapon that required labor, not training, making every able-bodied person a potential combatant. Imagine a small village hidden in a remote valley. They receive an order from Peralta's command: deliver 500 sharpened, fire-hardened spikes by next Friday. The entire community mobilized. The elderly, who knew the forest best, identified the best bamboo groves. Women and children often handled the tedious but critical tasks of cutting the bamboo sections and meticulously fire-hardening the tips over slow-burning cooking fires, disguising the operation as routine village activity. Men then carried these spikes, sometimes dozens of kilometers, across treacherous terrain. To the roadside deployment teams, this quiet, continuous labor carried an extreme risk. A single discovery by a Japanese patrol a pile of bamboo shavings, the smell of charred wood at an unusual time, or a villager caught carrying an oversized package meant instant, brutal reprisal. The Japanese employed a policy of collective punishment. If spikes were found near a village, the entire community might be burned to the ground and the men executed. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals how essential this network was for intelligence. The villagers who manufactured and transported the spikes also served as the resistance's eyes and ears. They were the ones who noted the precise routes of Japanese patrols, the timing of their supply convoys, and any new countermeasures being deployed. This intelligence, often relayed through coded messages involving the type or quantity of spikes being delivered, was far more valuable than the material itself. They would use local signs, a peculiar arrangement of cut wood, or the way laundry was hung to signal to the guerrilla teams the presence or absence of enemy patrols. Historians still argue whether the extreme risk taken by civilians in manufacturing and deploying the suitsat was a necessary component of total resistance, or whether it ultimately led to a disproportionate level of suffering and civilian casualties that could have been avoided. The debate highlights the ethical tightrope walked by guerrilla leaders like Peralta, who had to balance the need to strike the enemy with the moral imperative to protect the populace. You realize the profound level of trust and shared purpose required for this to work. Every spike planted was an act of faith that the resistance would protect them, and faith that the ultimate price would be worth the liberation. The simple, humble act of sharpening a piece of wood became the most radical political statement of the occupation. It bound the armed guerrillas and the civilian population into a single cohesive fighting force. The bamboo spike was the physical manifestation of the Filipino people's united will to resist. The massive decentralized effort to produce and deploy the suitsat traps necessitated a unique financial and logistical infrastructure, defining the guerrilla economy and barter. You examined the shadowy economic system that sustained the resistance, entirely bypassing and undermining the Japanese occupation currency. A mainstream historical fact is that the Japanese military introduced a fiat currency, the aforementioned Mickey Mouse money, which they printed in vast quantities. This inflation rapidly devalued the currency, leading to widespread economic instability and distrust among the Filipino people. The resistance, therefore, had to create a viable, trustworthy alternative to facilitate the flow of goods and services necessary for survival and continued fighting. Peralta's 6th Military District successfully implemented a system based on those emergency currency notes, backed by the promise of future repayment by the legitimate Philippine Commonwealth and the United States. While this was technically a fiat currency, its value lay in the widespread belief in the eventual American return and the unwavering trust in the guerrilla leadership. This currency was used for internal transactions within the resistance-control territories. However, many transactions, especially those involving goods critical for survival, reverted to pure barter. You observe the quiet, crucial exchanges that kept the guerrilla fighters fed and equipped. Bullets were exchanged for rice, and information for medicine. A farmer might trade a sack of milled rice for a guarantee of protection from Japanese reprisals, or perhaps for a small quantity of salt, which was a highly prized commodity. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the value placed on scrap metal, while metal was needed for the hybrid suitsat and later weapons. The resistance often prioritized the acquisition of vehicle parts and machine-gun links knot for use in the traps. But to trade with remote, collaborating villages for food, the metal was a highly concentrated portable currency. A handful of brass cartridge casings salvaged from a battlefield could be exchanged for enough dried fish and root vegetables to feed a small squad for a week. The value of an item was determined entirely by its utility in the Shadow War, not by its official price in Mickey Mouse money. The procurement of medical supplies was perhaps the most desperate form of barter. Since quinine, essential for treating malaria, which ravaged both sides, and basic antibiotics were nearly impossible to acquire, the guerrillas relied heavily on native remedies, but also occasionally engaged in higher-risk exchanges with sympathetic individuals working inside Japanese-controlled hospitals or through black market channels in the cities. Precise details on troop movements or patrol schedules was sometimes bartered for vials of medicine, highlighting the life-and-death stakes of intelligence gathering. Historians still argue whether the guerrilla economy's existence was a necessary, unavoidable consequence of war, or if it was a sophisticated, deliberate strategy by Peralta to create a parallel economic state that delegitimized the Japanese authority in the eyes of the populace. By maintaining a separate, functional economy, the resistance cemented its position as the true, legitimate governing body in the Philippines. You realize that the suitsat traps were not just military instruments, they were economic drivers. Every time a Japanese vehicle was crippled, it added to the confidence in the resistance's ability to win. thereby stabilizing the value of the emergency notes and encouraging further civilian cooperation. The bamboo spike was the physical guarantor of the shadow currency, providing the security necessary for the entire system of trust and barter to function and ensuring the war could continue indefinitely, even without external financial support. The ultimate test of the jungle ingenuity came in the crucial engagements that proved the Sutsat could not only inconvenience, but decisively defeat the enemy's heaviest armor. The Sutset versus the Shiki medium tank. You are placed in the midst of a carefully planned ambush, designed to eliminate a significant armored threat. A mainstream historical fact is that while the Type 95 was common, the Japanese also deployed heavier tanks, such as the Type 97 Chi, a medium tank, often called Shiki, weighing around 15 tons, into the Philippine interior to tackle the growing resistance. Stopping these machines required even greater ingenuity and a hybrid trap configuration. The ambush site is a narrow stretch of road, deliberately chosen near a ravine where the steep drop prevents the tank from simply driving around the disabled section. Peralta's team has deployed a hide-and-seek multi-layered trap. The surface area is riddled with fire-hardened bamboo spikes, designed to shred the rubber road wheels and provide the initial upward driving force. Crucially, in this field, they have buried several of the newly fabricated hybrid spike short. Hardened steel rebar points encased in bamboo for camouflage, placed precisely beneath the suspected path of the tank's inner track. You hear the heavy metallic clanking, the unmistakable sound of the Type 97 medium tank approaching, leading a small convoy. This tank is a serious adversary, protected by thicker armor than the light scout cars. As the tank rolls over the chosen kill zone, the first wave of bamboo spikes does its job. They are crushed or splintered, but not before they create dozens of tiny, almost invisible, entry points into the road wheels and track links. Then comes the main impact. The enormous concentrated weight of the 15-ton tank slams down onto the hidden U-pungled steel spikes. The force is catastrophic. The sharpened rebar point, driven by tons of pressure, finds the seam or the relatively thin armor plating, protecting a critical undercarriage component, perhaps the final drive housing or the tensioning gear of the track assembly. The sound is not an explosion, but a terrible high-pitched screech of grinding metal, followed by a violent, shuddering lurch that brings the massive machine to an abrupt, dead stop. The critical component has been pierced or jammed, effectively throwing the tank's track or jamming its drive mechanism. The steel had been defeated by the combined physics of weight and concentrated pressure. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this engagement is that the accompanying Japanese infantry, now highly sensitized to the threat, often reacted not by dismounting to fight, but by freezing in place, convinced the entire area was mined. This reaction was a learned response from the previous dual-threat traps, giving the guerrillas precious seconds to initiate their rifle fire and throw their scavenged Molotov cocktails, focusing on the immobilized tank's engine vents and access hatches. The Type 97, now a static metal pillbox, is subjected to a hail of small arms fire and incendiary attacks. Without the ability to maneuver, its advantage is neutralized. Its heavy armor is useless against the flames licking at the engine compartment, and its cannon is unable to traverse quickly enough to find the unseen enemy in the jungle. Historians still argue whether the guerrilla focus on immobilization, rather than immediate destruction, was the single most effective operational tactic of the entire resistance. By crippling tanks and supply lines, the Sutset traps forced the Japanese to continuously move troops and resources away from combat, turning the occupation into an unending logistical failure. You watch the scene unfold. The Japanese tank is burning, the crew is either incapacitated or fleeing, and the column is in total disarray. The victory is total. The quiet ingenuity of a farmer and a blacksmith, harnessing the power of a common plant and a piece of scrap metal, has defeated the pride of the Imperial Army's mechanized warfare. The message was sent loud and clear: not even your heaviest armor can protect you in these islands. The tactical victories of the Sutsa traps were immediately leveraged by the Resistance's clandestine communications network, ushering in an era of propaganda and myth-making. You realize that the success of the improvised traps was not just a military win, but a powerful story carefully crafted and broadcast to boost morale across the occupied islands and inform the Allied world. A mainstream historical fact is that propaganda was a critical element of the Pacific War. For the Allies, demonstrating that the Japanese war machine was not invincible was paramount. For the Filipino resistance, proving that their unconventional methods were effective was essential for maintaining civilian cooperation and recruitment. The tank-stopping stick was the perfect narrative. Peralta's highly secretive radio station, KZGZ, played a crucial role. Operating out of the deep jungle, under constant threat of Japanese direction-finding sweeps, these broadcasts would relay news of successful ambushes. The language was often exaggerated, not for deception, but for inspiration. The story wasn't just that a tank was immobilized. The narrative celebrated the ingenuity of the Filipino farmer, whose simple courage and cunning defeated the enemy's complex arrogance. You listen to a reconstructed broadcast, the faint, crackling voice offering hope. The enemy boasts of their steel dragons, but the soil of the Philippines remembers. A small stick, fire-hardened by the hands of our own, has pierced the heart of their machines. The ground itself is now our weapon. This storytelling created a potent myth. The Sutsat became the symbol of David versus Goliath. The narrative emphasized that the enemy's most significant advantage, their heavy, mechanized weight, was also their most fatal weakness when confronted with local knowledge. This quirky or fringe tidbit of resistance history involves the use of humor in the propaganda. Resistance leaflets, often crudely printed and secretly distributed, sometimes featured simple cartoonish drawings of a frustrated Japanese soldier scratching his head next to a flattered truck or a tank driver weeping over a broken tread, all due to a tiny sharp stick. This use of gentle sarcasm and humor helped demystify the enemy, making them appear foolish and vulnerable rather than terrifying. The propaganda served a critical secondary purpose, communicating with MacArthur's command. By reporting the success of the bamboo spikes, Peralta was not only boosting morale, but also providing proof of his organization's effectiveness, which directly led to the prioritization of those covert submarine supply runs, as we recall from Section 16. The propaganda thus had a practical, material outcome. Historians still argue whether the most effective use of the Sutsat narrative was inside the Philippines, rallying the local populace, or externally, influencing Allied opinion and resource allocation. The fact that the story of the anti-tank stick became known in U.S. circles, often repeated as a testament to Filipino bravery, certainly helped secure the commitment for the eventual return. You realize the profound power of narrative in total war. The Japanese had superior technology and firepower, but the Filipinos had the superior story of every person contributing, of nature fighting back, and of ingenuity triumphing over brute force. This myth of the unstoppable bamboo spike sustained the spirit of resistance through years of brutal occupation, ensuring that when the time for liberation finally came, the fighting force was not only still intact, but deeply rooted and powerfully motivated. The propaganda had secured the moral high ground and prepared the archipelago for the final coordinated push. The years of clandestine warfare, fueled by indigenous weapons and unyielding courage, finally led to liberation's dawn. The return of MacArthur. You are present for the culmination of the guerrilla efforts, observing how the established spike-hardened resistance networks played an indispensable role in the final push to reclaim the Philippines. A mainstream historical fact is that when General MacArthur's forces landed at Leyte in October 1944, the situation was fundamentally different from what the Japanese expected. The Americans didn't land in a hostile, passive territory. They landed in an archipelago where organized, effective Allied forces, the guerrillas, were already waiting, ready to rise up. The years of resistance, secured in part by the operational paralysis caused by the Sutsat traps, had paid off. Peralta's 6th Military District and other guerrilla groups across the islands had spent years gathering intelligence, establishing communication lines, and, crucially, pinning down enormous numbers of Japanese troops. The success of the bamboo spikes had been twofold. Not only did they slow the Japanese, but they forced them to maintain large static garrisons for road security, preventing those troops from being deployed to defend the coasts. You witnessed the coordinated effort as American forces landed. The guerrillas immediately moved to seize and secure infrastructure. They captured bridges, ambushed Japanese columns attempting to reach the landing zones, and, most importantly, served as indispensable guides and forward intelligence units. The guerrillas knew every trail, every Japanese bunker, and every secure supply line. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals a moment of perfect strategic coordination, the sutsat traps. Now, primarily hybrid steel bamboo devices were used one last time in massive numbers. They were deployed along all potential Japanese counterattack routes leading toward the American beachheads, ensuring that any armored unit the Japanese tried to send as reinforcement would be crippled and stalled, turning the fight into a slow, brutal infantry engagement where the Americans and guerrillas had the advantage. The ultimate function of the bamboo spike was to buy time and limit the enemy's mobility at the most critical juncture of the war. The intelligence provided by the resistance was invaluable. For example, guerrillas provided precise details on Japanese defensive positions and mined areas, allowing American bombers and artillery to strike preemptively and saving countless lives. The knowledge accrued over years of living and fighting in the jungle became the greatest single asset of the liberation forces. Historians still argue whether the liberation of the Philippines would have taken 2 to 3 times longer, resulting in significantly higher Allied casualties without the direct combat assistance, intelligence, and logistical support provided by the 260,000-strong organized guerrilla force. It is widely acknowledged that the effectiveness of the resistance streamlined the entire campaign. You realize that the War of the Simple Bamboo Stick had achieved its final highest objective. It had kept the flame of resistance alive, it had tied down the enemy, and it had ensured that when MacArthur did return, he found a ready-made army waiting for him. The jungle roads, once traversed with arrogant ease by Japanese tanks, were now the scenes of Japanese retreat and defeat, secured by the very ingenuity they had dismissed. The liberation was a testament to the power of a population refusing to be conquered. With liberation achieved, the focus inevitably shifted from fighting to rebuilding, and the incredible tale of the simple weapon faded into the complex narratives of conventional victory, leading to post-war recognition and legacy. You look back at the quiet fate of the ingenious Filipino fighters and the simple bamboo spike they used. A mainstream historical fact is that immediately following the war, the primary focus of the United States was the immense effort of reconstruction and the formal recognition of the conventional Philippine Army units and the returning American forces. Guerrilla recognition was a convoluted process. While leaders like Macario Peralta were highly decorated and immediately integrated into the post-war Philippine military and government, Peralta himself rising to the rank of Brigadier General, the vast majority of the individual fighters faced an uphill battle for official acknowledgement. The process of officially recognizing the hundreds of thousands of guerrilla fighters involved mountains of paperwork, validation of claims, and navigating a bureaucracy ill-equipped to handle the decentralized, improvised nature of the resistance. Many of the records confirming service were lost or destroyed during the war, making it difficult for the rank-and-file fighters to prove their active combat roles. The sutsat traps, the physical symbol of this ingenuity, quickly faded from the center stage of historical memory. They were replaced by the narrative of big battles, large armies, and the massive firepower of the returning American forces. The bamboo spike, being organic, simply decayed back into the earth, leaving behind no permanent monument or physical evidence of its immense strategic impact. Unlike the rusting hulks of the Japanese armor, it had crippled. A quirky or fringe tidbit reveals the long-term irony of the recognition process. While the intelligence and coordination provided by the guerrillas were instrumental to MacArthur's success, many Filipino veterans, particularly those whose service was not immediately validated by the U.S. government, had their claims for back pay and veterans benefits systematically denied or delayed for decades under various U.S. congressional acts. This often left the true heroes of the Shadow War facing economic hardship, while the story of their ingenuity was largely sidelined in favor of the easier tokerosis narratives of conventional military service. You observe that the physical legacy of the sutsat is found not in museums, but in the quiet pride of the Visayan Islanders and the anecdotal histories passed down through families. It is a story preserved by the very people who risked their lives to manufacture and deploy the weapon. It is a reminder that the greatest war technology can sometimes be the cheapest, most abundant, and most locally controlled. Historians still argue whether the quiet fading of the sutsat story from mainstream Western history was a deliberate post-war choice to simplify the narrative of victory focusing on American might. simply an unavoidable consequence of the bureaucratic nightmare involved in documenting unconventional warfare. Regardless, the tale of the tank-stopping stick stands as a powerful, necessary correction to the standard narrative of the Pacific conflict. You realize that the true legacy of the bamboo spike is not in medals or monuments, but in the enduring lesson that technology, no matter how advanced, can always be defeated by ingenuity, local knowledge, and absolute, unwavering determination. The story of Peralta and his simple, magnificent weapon serves as a permanent, powerful testament to the resourcefulness of the human spirit when pushed to the ultimate extreme. We arrive now at the final reflection, moving beyond the specific tactics of war to embrace the enduring lesson of necessity. You have followed the thread of this story from the overwhelming might of the Japanese invasion to the ultimate quiet triumph of a fire-hardened bamboo spike. The lesson here transcends military history. It speaks to the universal principles of human ingenuity under duress. A mainstream historical fact that encapsulates this lesson is the fundamental principle of asymmetrical warfare. A weaker, technologically inferior force must never fight the enemy on its own terms. It must shift the contest to a domain where the enemy's strength becomes a liability. The Japanese tanks, designed for speed and armor, became slow, vulnerable, and expensive targets when forced to navigate roads weaponized by undetectable organic materials. The Sutsat trap is the perfect illustration of innovation, born of absolute necessity. Peralta's men had no access to factories, no supply lines for steel, and no means of manufacturing high-grade explosives. They were reduced to the most fundamental equation of survival. What do we have, and what does the enemy rely on? The answer was bamboo and momentum. The solution was simple, scalable, and entirely sustainable. You recall the meticulous process, the perfect geometry of the sharpened tip, the crucial step of fire hardening to achieve structural integrity, and the ingenious camouflage tactics to neutralize the enemy's sweep methods. Every step was a testament to the idea that genius isn't about complexity, it's about elegant simplicity. This quirky or fringe tidbit reveals a powerful parallel. This concept of weaponizing the environment through the use of localized natural materials is an ancient tradition across Southeast Asia, often used in defense against various colonial powers. The Sutsat wasn't just a World War II weapon, it was the modernization of an ancient principle of defense, adapted to defeat a modern machine. The history of resistance is often written not in treaties, but in the collective memory of how to turn a common plant into a deadly defense. Historians still argue whether the Sutsat should be taught in military academies as a prime example of successful non-lethal, in the initial sense, aerodinial warfare, demonstrating that resourcefulness can always negate a technological advantage, or if its success was too dependent on the specific tropical environment and the initial complacency of the Japanese forces to be a universally applicable model. The debate aside, its power as an inspirational story remains absolute. You realize that the real victory of the bamboo spike wasn't the metal it punctured, but the hope it provided. It taught a population living under brutal occupation that they were not powerless. It affirmed that their common labor, their local knowledge, and their native environment were assets far more valuable than the enemy's imported steel. The story of the Filipino resistance fighter who turned bamboo spikes into traps that stopped tank columns is not just a tale of war. It is a profound testament to the indefatigable spirit of a people. It reminds us that when cornered, the human mind is capable of creating extraordinary solutions from the most ordinary of materials. The ultimate armor is not steel, but the clarity and resilience of the mind determined to survive. The quiet now settles, and the rumble of those distant tanks finally fades, leaving only the soft sound of the jungle at rest. You can let go of the tension now, that tightness you've carried since the first column appeared on the road. The journey is complete, and the memory of the fire-hardened bamboo spike, shining faintly under the moon, begins to soften, integrating itself back into the earth from which it came. There is a sense of peace that follows such immense struggle, a deep restorative calm that permeates the atmosphere after the final battle is won, and the necessity for such extraordinary courage has passed. The men and women who wielded that simple, ingenious weapon have long since put down their machetes, returned to their fields, and begun the quiet, difficult work of healing and rebuilding. Their legacy is not one of destruction, but of incredible resilience. a gentle but firm assurance that the human spirit will always find a way to meet the dawn, even after the longest night. Let the images of the jungle roads, the silent, invisible traps, and the quiet dignity of the people who built them now recede into the peaceful darkness, knowing that their story, however hidden, will always be remembered as a victory for ingenuity and the unwavering will to be free. Sleep well.